Good morning. You're probably as surprised to see me here as I am to be here. I'm sure that more than a few of you said to yourselves last Sunday after you saw the bulletin, who is Gerry West and why is he bringing the message? It was me. I'm the guy that sits back in the corner back there and usually doesn't say boo to a goose. As to why is he bringing the message? Well, someone, and it certainly was not me, told Pastor Denise that I'm a lay minister at MCC of the John Shepherd, and I've been that for many years. In fact, for almost a year, I functioned as the only pastor when we were between pastors. So she asked me if I would bring the message, and while she was on vacation, and after some hesitation, I said that I would. That being said, Gentle Shepherd is a very small church, almost what you would call a house church. I think that probably on a good Sunday, the congregation probably wouldn't fill more than the first 2 rows in this church. So I have to admit that when I look across this sea of faces, my knees get a little wobbly. Not that they're not very nice faces. So if I suddenly disappear behind the podium, you'll know what happened. Do not call 911. I spent most of my career as a teacher, so during some of my message, I will probably sound like a teacher. And I was a drama teacher, so I like telling stories, so some of my message will be in story form. And once in a while, I even get into preaching. I don't know where that came from. But I promise not to speak too long. In the church where I was raised, preachers never got warmed up until they'd gone on for 45 minutes. And if they spoke for less than an hour, I think they felt they hadn't given the congregation their money's worth of hellfire and damnation. I got over that a long time ago. I'm more in tune with the old minister who told me once that if you couldn't say what you had to say in 20 or 30 minutes, it probably wasn't worth saying in the first place. In my talks with Pastor Denise, the subject of Epiphany came up, and suggested that I talk about that a bit, because it was not something that is really emphasized in this church. You are familiar with Epiphany as the visitation of the Magi to the Christ child, which is celebrated the first Sunday after 12th night. But in some churches, there are 3 different epiphanies of the Lord, celebrated during the weeks following Christmas. What is an epiphany? An epiphany is an appearance or manifestation of a divine being, or a sudden manifestation or perception of the essential nature or meaning of something. In the church here, it is the revelation of different aspects of Christ. The first one is the revelation of Christ to the Gentiles in the person of the wise men. The second one is the first public revelation of Christ as a child of God by God himself, as found in the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptizer. You remember that as Jesus was being baptized, the skies opened up, the Spirit of God descended as a dove, and a voice was heard saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The third revelation of Christ was the revelation of Christ's miraculous nature, as found in the miracle of the water into wine at the marriage of Cana. There are other epiphanies in the Bible, of course. Jonah certainly had an epiphany when he discovered himself inside the fish and realized that when God tells you to do something, you probably should do it. Saul of Tarsus had an epiphany which knocked him right off his horse when he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. Peter had an epiphany when he realized that his vision, that nothing the Lord had made should be called unclean, opened up the door to the church for the Gentiles, and so for us. And we all have our own epiphanies, of course. I'm sure in one way or another, probably not as dramatic as those that I just mentioned. But we can associate ourselves with all of Christ's epiphanies. We follow the light until we find Jesus. We are baptized by water and the Spirit as an outward acknowledgement of our faith, and we experience the miracle of new birth. Today I'm going to talk about the third Epiphany, the marriage at Cana, and I'm going to begin with a story. Have you ever really wished that you could have been at some of the events where Christ was carrying out his mission, that you could have seen everything that went on, see how the people react, see the smells, sights, sounds, everything? Because the stories themselves are really rather brief. But you would like to see everything in detail. And that's what my story is all about. The quiet young man thought the party had started pretty well for a party. He didn't much like parties. He preferred more intimate social activities, interesting discussions, studies of the Torah, things like that. But there were lots of people here, lots of important people, and lots of unimportant people like him trying to be more important, he thought cynically. He hadn't wanted to come, but his father had insisted. Said that going to social events like this put you in touch with influential people, and influential people could help you in your career. Besides, he said if he didn't attend this party, his father had threatened to have him stoned. He hadn't meant it, of course. Or had he? Anyway, here he was. The bridegroom himself was much in evidence, glad-handing his friends and sharing off-color jokes with his closest companions. The young man wasn't too impressed with the bridegroom. Instead, the young man was particularly impressed by another guest, whose name was Jesus. In the back of his mind, the young man found something teasing his memory. Something about this Jesus. Something about some connection with that John the Baptizer. But what was it? He needed to pay more attention to things. Pay attention. That's how you got ahead. His father kept telling him that. The young man had gone down to see John the Baptizer at the Jordan. It was all the talk of Jerusalem. This crazy, unkempt man dressed in rags kept calling everyone to repentance and splashing water on them. At first it was just a lark, and with some of his friends who were also students of the Rabbi Gamaliel. There was a lot of laughter and rude talk. He had done his share of it himself. Everybody laughed but Saul of Tarsus, another of Gamaliel's students, who was a real firebrand. He said that John should be crucified, but then he thought everyone who didn't agree with him ought to be eliminated. The laughter stopped for the young man. He was horrified by Saul's extremism and moved away from his friends. Then slowly, what John was saying took hold of him. It was no longer a lark, but something very serious. A force stronger than he was drew him slowly down to the water, drew him into the water. He had gone down into the water with John and been baptized. Many of his friends had laughed at him, and some of them had cut him cold, but he didn't care. Then later he heard something he couldn't remember, something about John and Jesus. Now the young man's eyes followed Jesus. Jesus had his own way of working the crowd, a way much gentler than the bridegroom's. With a word here, a touch there, a smile. He seemed to include everyone in the party. No one seemed too unimportant to receive a bit of attention from Jesus. When Jesus' eyes met the young man's eyes from across the room, he smiled warmly and nodded. The young man felt such a rush of feeling that he was amazed. His heart pounded against his chest so hard, he thought people must be hearing it. And then Jesus moved on to someone else. The young man noticed that Jesus carried a cup of wine with him that he seldom drank from it. The young man looked down at his own cup. It was still almost full. He took a sip and made a small face. It was not a very good wine. An older woman standing beside him, noticing his grimace, smiled and said, "Why don't you wait for the good wine?" The young man was puzzled. It wasn't customary to serve the cheaper wine first. Usually at a party, you waited until people had had so much to drink that they were not discriminating before you served the inferior wine. The young man recognized the woman as the one who had entered with Jesus, his mother, he supposed. He was about to speak, but then she moved away. The young man sat his drink down on a table. The crowd was getting louder and louder as time went on, and the level of the wine in the wineskins sank lower and lower. The young man didn't much like parties when they reached this stage. People lost their inhibitions, became noisier and more crude as the wine took effect. No wonder the wise man said in Proverbs, "Wine is a mocker and beer a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise." The young man noticed that already, here and there in the shadows, some of the overindulgent had laid down to sleep it off. Then the young man noticed a most unusual thing. As Jesus passed by them, he would pause and then lean over and cover them with their cloaks and smile almost sadly. Then the tenor of the party seemed to change. The young man heard grumbling, and it became apparent that the wineskins were empty. He thought instantly about leaving. He knew that parties could become ugly when the host ran out of wine. He felt sorry for the bridegroom. To run out of wine at your wedding party was a great embarrassment and a bad omen for the success of your marriage. As it happened, Jesus was close to the young man when the mother approached, and the young man could overhear their conversation. It was quite puzzling. The mother said, "Jesus, the wine is gone." And she seemed to think that Jesus could do something about it. The young man wondered for a moment if Jesus was the wine merchant. But the conversation became even more puzzling. Jesus said, "Is that any of your business or ours, mother? Yours or mine? This isn't my time. Don't push me." He sounded almost desperate. The woman simply smiled, laid her hand on her son's arm, and said to some nearby servants, "Whatever he tells you to do, see that you do it." Jesus threw up his hands, and the young man thought he heard him mutter, "Jewish mothers." But he drew a deep breath, looked up to heaven, and turned to the servants and said, "Do you see those water jugs?" He pointed to some vessels whose main purpose was to hold water for ritual cleansing. "Fill them with water." The servants stared at him in bewilderment, but accustomed to following instructions, they went out with their pitchers and soon had the jars brimming over with water. Then Jesus said, "Take your pitchers, dip them in the jars, and go present them to the wine steward. Then replenish the guests' cups." The servants looked at Jesus with total disbelief. But something they saw in his face moved them to do as they were told. The young man himself was incredulous. What in the world was Jesus doing? Surely he didn't think that the people at the party were so drunk they wouldn't know they were drinking water instead of wine. Then Jesus said a curious thing to the young man. He said, "No, my friend, that isn't it at all." For a second, the young man wondered if he had spoken out loud, and he knew that he hadn't. Open-mouthed, he stared at Jesus. Then Jesus picked up a cup, dipped it in the jar, and handed it to the young man. He said as the young man took the glass, "I'm glad you waited for the good wine." And then very curiously he added, "This is a sign of the new covenant." The young man knew he was staring like an idiot, but he raised the glass and took a sip of the wine. Never in his life had he tasted anything like it. His mind reeled. A great peace came over him in the midst of the noisy party. A great peace. And he was flooded with a warmth which was akin to love. One sip, and it became the center of his existence. And suddenly, somehow, the young man recognized the wonderful event in which he was involved. Things came flooding back to him about John and about Jesus coming to be baptized by John. And he knew that this man was the Messiah, the one for whom the whole Hebrew nation had waited so long, the one whom John talked about. The young man fell to his knees as Jesus quickly lifted him to his feet and, holding a finger to his lips in a request for silence, moved away. The young man stepped over the people passed out on the floor, ducked around the ones who were moving so unsteadily about him, and heard someone being violently ill as he walked out into the moonlight. He was filled with a sudden burst of compassion, and he said, if only they had waited for the good stuff. And then he thought, if only they too could taste the good wine. He hurried in and snatched up a cup of wine. He returned outside where the man who had been so ill was leaning exhausted against the wall. And he held the man's head in his hand, lifted the cup of wine to the man's lips, and the man drank. The young man watched as the man's glazed eyes cleared, the flush left his face, and his shoulders straightened. The young man turned, and there was Jesus, standing, watching. In Jesus' eyes, the young man read approval. And then Jesus said, come and follow me. And the young man knew that it would be forever. Well, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I suppose it's disturbing in some ways. And remember that you don't have to believe it. This was no sedate party where scriptures were being quoted in every corner. This was an all-out blast. Some translations even say that when the guests had had too much to drink, the host would nervously bring out the cheap, not the rich, good wine. At least one translation, the translation we read today, said that the people were drunk. But if we think that Jesus would not be present at a place where the wine was flowing like water, no pun intended, then we're wrong. Would Jesus himself be involved in the overindulgence? I can't imagine it. Well, would he be there? Where else would he be? He himself said, I am come not to bring the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. One of the chief complaints that the Pharisees had against Jesus was his association with publicans and sinners. Good grief, he talked to women, and not even decent women, prostitutes and adulteresses. He sat down to dinner with publicans, and worse than that, with tax collectors, the lowest form of life in Israel, unless it's goats and sheep, or goats and pigs. What's so bad about a few people live over in life? I've always thought this was a singularly insignificant event to introduce Christ as a miracle worker. I mean, later he healed the sick and raised people from the dead. Why choose turning water into wine? But then I think, isn't the Last Supper just a continuation of this miracle, in which Jesus, in turn, changed the wine into something much more precious at another feast? This was his first recorded miracle performed in public. Were there other miracles before this? Probably. But there were private miracles, perhaps a little more meat at the dinner table, a little wood that lasted all night on a cold night, the spontaneous healing of a cutter blister for his parents or siblings. The reason I think this is probably true is that when Mary approached Jesus at the party with a statement about the wine, there appeared to be no doubt in her mind whatsoever that Jesus could fix it if he chose to. I don't think Mary really knew what it was that she was asking. I don't think she realized that encouraging Jesus to perform this miracle, she was moving him along the path which would lead to the final sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. Jesus, on the other hand, knew the doors this act was opening, and that they would never be closed again. He realized that this was something far different from miraculously filling the milk jug up in the privacy of his home. This would be seen and reported abroad. You may ask people for secrecy, as Jesus did many times, but you know how we people are. We just have to share interesting things with our friends, and so it goes. Something in Jesus cried out, no, I don't want to do it. I'm not ready. But he does do it. And as much as he loved his mother, I don't think he did it because she wanted him to. Rather, I think that when he said, it's not yet my time, He was arguing with God and not with Mary. The human side of Jesus struggled with his destiny. It always did. But Jesus always overcame. Finally, as he said again in the garden, not thy will, not my will, but thine be done. And he performed the miracle that thrust him on the world stage. Did Jesus, even at this early period, know what the final results of his actions would be? He knew the Old Testament backwards and forwards. His sermons and sayings are sprinkled with Old Testament prophecies. So of course he was familiar with, even at the beginning, with Isaiah 53:5. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. He had been recognized publicly at the baptism as a child of God. He had come through the fire of the temptation. He must have been well aware of the Old Testament vision of the Messiah as a sacrificial lamb without blemish and without spot. The young man whose story I told you has a lesson for us all. Wait for the good stuff. The good stuff is worth waiting for. I don't know about any of you, but it took me a long time to learn that lesson. It takes some of us a long time to get to Canaan, let alone to Calvary. Sometimes we are so desperate to fill our lives that we settle for things which have very little meaning in the long run. Whether this search is for someone to be with, for excitement, experiences, popularity, knowledge, wealth. Sometimes we just overwhelm our lives with busyness in a desperate search for contentment. If only I do enough. If only I be enough. If only I represent enough. Then I'll be happy. And as we hurry from one new experience to another, the doors to our lives become so clogged with all that is meaningless that there is no room for Jesus to even knock, let alone enter in. But all we actually need is the realization that Jesus is at the center of our being. And if we rely on the Holy Spirit, she will guide us to those things which are beneficial in leading a life which is good. In Ephesians 4, Paul says, we take our lead from Christ, who is the source of everything we do. Jesus alone is the source of the good stuff. And we may fool ourselves for a while, but anything else is a pale imitation. Thank you for letting me speak today. God bless you.